millionaire refuses to help a poor man, only to be saved by him years later. An accident uncovers hidden secrets and a betrayal that almost destroyed him. Standing beside the man he once humiliated, he discovers the true culprits behind his tragic past. Now he must face the enemies who planned his downfall and right the wrongs that haunt him. The rain pounded against the mirrored windows of the towering building that stood in the heart of New York City's financial district. From the 45th floor, Jonathan Montgomery gazed out at the city like an emperor surveying his kingdom. His cold eyes scanned the urban landscape while his fingers drummed on the black marble table, keeping rhythm with the raindrops sliding down the glass. The office, decorated with calculated minimalism, reflected the personality of its occupant. There was no room for sentimentality or personal items, only achievements materialized in awards and certificates that adorned one wall. The other wall displayed a digital screen with real-time quotes from the world's major stock exchanges. "Mr. Montgomery, your next meeting starts in 5 minutes, announced Sophia, his executive assistant, through the intercom. Her voice betrayed a slight tremor, common to all who had to interact with the businessman. "Send them in," he replied curtly, adjusting the knot of his Italian tie in the reflection of the window. Montgomery Enterprises had become one of the largest holdings in the country under his leadership. At 45, Jonathan was the epitome of corporate success, impeccably dressed, his graying hair strategically trimmed, and a posture that exuded authority. Every decision he made was calculated, every move part of a larger strategy. The solid oak door opened, allowing a group of executives to enter. Among them was Richard Mendez, his right-hand man for over a decade, carrying a folder with the latest financial reports. The air in the room grew even denser as Jonathan turned to face them. "Gentlemen, let's be objective," he began, his deep voice filling the room. "The numbers from the last quarter." A commotion in the hallway interrupted him. Through the frosted glass of the door, a figure could be seen gesturing with Sophia. The assistant seemed distressed, trying to prevent someone from entering. The door opened abruptly. A man in his 50s, dressed simply and with a desperate look, burst into the room. His face was marked by sleepless nights and worry. "Mr. Montgomery, please forgive the intrusion, but I need to speak with you," said the man, his voice choked. "My name is Anthony Smith. I own the auto repair shop on the land your company bought in the Bronx." Jonathan remained impassive, merely raising an eyebrow slightly. Sophia appeared at the door, mortified. "I'm sorry, Mr. Montgomery, he ran past me." With a gesture, Jonathan dismissed the assistant. His eyes studied the intruder coldly, like a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope. "Mr. Smith, you're interrupting an important meeting," he declared, his voice cutting like ice. "If you want an audience, schedule it through the proper channels." "I tried," Anthony exclaimed, taking a step forward. "For weeks, I've been trying to speak with you. The fire destroyed everything I had. 30 years of work, and now they say the insurance won't cover it because—" "Mr. Smith," Jonathan interrupted, "your personal issues are not this company's problem. The land was acquired legally, and any disputes with insurers should be handled by your lawyers." "But you don't understand," Anthony insisted, his dignity struggling against despair. "That shop was all I had. It was my family's livelihood, my children's future. I just need a chance, a loan to start over somewhere else." Jonathan circled his desk, approaching Anthony with measured steps. His gaze was the same he gave to failing businesses before buying them for a fraction of their value. "Mr. Smith, I'll be clear, your failure is not my responsibility. If you weren't competent enough to protect your business, don't expect others to carry your burden." "Security," he called, his voice echoing through the intercom. As two burly security guards entered the room, Anthony remained standing, his last hopes crumbling before the businessman's coldness. "You may have all the money in the world," Anthony murmured as he was led away, "but one day you'll learn that there are things money can't buy, and when that day comes, you'll understand the true value of what you're destroying." Jonathan watched the scene with disinterest, as if watching an irrelevant commercial on TV. Turning back to the executives, who remained in awkward silence, he adjusted his tie once more. "As I was saying, gentlemen, about the numbers from the last quarter. The meeting continued as usual, but outside the rain kept falling, washing away Anthony Smith's tears, which mixed with the drops streaming down his face. What no one could predict was that this seemingly insignificant encounter would be the first chapter of a story that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. 3 years had passed since the encounter with Anthony Smith. Montgomery Enterprises had grown exponentially, becoming an even more powerful conglomerate. The old auto repair shop's land now housed a luxurious business complex, a symbol of the relentless progress Jonathan so valued. In his penthouse in Manhattan, the businessman admired the sunrise while sipping his imported coffee. The panoramic view of the city revealed a skyline dotted with skyscrapers, many of them belonging to his empire. His phone vibrated, bringing a message from Richard Mendez. Emergency board meeting confirmed for today, 9 a.m. Urgent matter. Something about the tone of the message bothered him. In recent months, small details had begun to disrupt his meticulously planned routine. Important documents mysteriously disappearing, negotiations failing at the last moment, and rumors of discontent among minority shareholders. "Mary," he called his housekeeper, "prepare my briefcase with the documents for today's meeting." The silence that followed made him realize he was alone. Another staff member had quit without notice. It was the third household employee to leave that month. Irritated, he adjusted his own briefcase and headed to the private elevator. On the way to the company headquarters, his personal driver remained silent, another sign of the strange times they were living in. George, always so talkative, now barely exchanged words with his boss. Through the bulletproof glass of the Mercedes, Jonathan watched the city wake up, unaware that this would be one of the last moments of his former life. The boardroom was full when he arrived. Familiar faces awaited him, but something was different. The air seemed charged with palpable tension. Richard Mendez, his right-hand man, kept his eyes fixed on a folder of documents, avoiding his gaze. "Good morning, gentlemen." Jonathan began the meeting with his usual authority. "What's the urgency that justifies an emergency meeting?" Helen Vasquez, one of the longest-serving board members, cleared her throat before speaking. "Jonathan, we've become aware of a series of irregularities in the company's recent acquisitions. Documents that suggest questionable practices." The businessman maintained his composure, though his tense jaw betrayed his irritation. "What kind of questionable practices?" Richard finally looked up. "We have evidence of manipulation in the valuations of acquired companies, bribes in inspections, and—" He hesitated for a moment. "A possible involvement in the fire at the auto repair shop in the Bronx 3 years ago." The unspoken name of Anthony Smith hung in the air like a ghost. Jonathan felt an involuntary chill run down his spine, but his voice remained firm. "Serious accusations require concrete evidence. Where are these documents?" "Here," Helen replied, sliding a folder across the table. "And they've already been forwarded to the appropriate authorities." As he flipped through the papers, Jonathan realized he was facing a meticulously orchestrated conspiracy. Every document, every piece of evidence had been collected over years. His own allies had turned against him. "This is ridiculous," he declared, slamming the folder shut. "You don't have the authority to—" "Yes, we do," Richard interrupted. "The board has voted to temporarily remove you as CEO, pending the outcome of the investigations." Jonathan felt control slipping through his fingers like sand. His empire, built over decades, was being taken before his eyes. But he wouldn't go down without a fight. "I have enough shares to veto any decision by this board," he argued, his voice laden with threat. "Not anymore," Helen replied, handing him another document. "Your shares have been frozen by court order, and there's more. Your trip to Dubai tomorrow was deliberately kept on the schedule. It will be your final act as the company's representative." The businessman studied the faces around him, searching for a single ally among those who had spent years fawning over his power. He found only cold, calculating expressions, distorted reflections of his own personality. He rose slowly, adjusting his Italian suit with practiced dignity. "You don't know who you're dealing with. This isn't over." "It already is, Jonathan," Richard replied, a discreet smile playing on his lips. "Your private jet awaits you tomorrow at 7 a.m. Don't be late." Leaving the boardroom, Jonathan felt the weight of triumphant gazes on his back. In his office, he began making frantic calls to lawyers and influential contacts, to no avail. The lines were blocked, his access revoked, his passwords invalidated. For the first time in a long time, he felt vulnerable. The view of the city through the window now seemed threatening. Somewhere down there, he imagined, Anthony Smith must be smiling, as if he knew his prophetic words were finally coming true. The early morning arrived silently and damp in New York City. Jonathan remained awake in his penthouse, surrounded by papers and documents he had hastily gathered. The clock read 4:30 a.m. when his private phone, the only one still working, vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "Don't board the plane." His fingers hovered over the screen for a few seconds, considering a response, but something stopped him. Years of business experience had taught him to distrust anonymous warnings. Still, the message fueled a restlessness that had been gnawing at him since the board meeting. At 6:15 a.m., the driver, no longer George, but a replacement with a neutral expression, arrived to take him to the airport. His luggage was minimal, a briefcase with essential documents and a small carry-on. Jonathan had spent the last hours transferring resources to offshore accounts and organizing his counterattack strategy. The private airport was nearly deserted when he arrived. His private jet, a customized Cessna Citation X Plus, waited on the runway. The aircraft, which once represented status and power, now seemed strangely menacing under the still dark sky. "Mr. Montgomery," greeted the pilot, a professional he had never seen before. "All set for takeoff." "Where's Phil?" Jonathan asked, referring to his usual pilot. "Last-minute vacation, sir. I'm the designated replacement." Another piece out of place in the puzzle that was forming. Jonathan climbed the aircraft stairs with hesitant steps, unusual for someone so decisive. The plane was as impeccable as ever, but small details caught his attention. A different smell than usual, the temperature slightly cooler, the absence of the flight attendant. He settled into his preferred seat by the window. Through the glass, he watched the ground crew's movements, trying to spot familiar faces. None. The entire crew had been replaced. The phone vibrated again. Same message, different number. "Don't board the plane," this time accompanied by a photo. His heart raced as he recognized the face in the image. Phil, his pilot, apparently unconscious in a place he couldn't identify. Cold sweat dripped down his forehead as his mind quickly processed the possibilities. Getting up and leaving now would seem like paranoia, but staying seated could be his last mistake. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin the takeoff procedures," announced the unfamiliar voice of the pilot over the intercom. Jonathan closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and made his decision. He stood up abruptly, heading to the cockpit. "We need to delay this flight," he declared with authority. "An emergency has come up." The co-pilot turned, revealing a smile that chilled his blood. "I'm sorry, Mr. Montgomery, but we have explicit orders to take off. Please return to your seat." At that moment, he realized he had no choice. The aircraft door was already closed, the engines beginning to roar. He returned to his seat, his hands trembling slightly as he fastened his seatbelt. The jet taxied down the runway, gaining speed. Jonathan watched every movement, every sound, every vibration, looking for signs of what was to come. The takeoff was normal, but as soon as they reached cruising altitude, the first irregularities began. Minor turbulence, initially ignorable, intensified. The plane shook more and more, and strange sounds echoed through the fuselage. Through the window, Jonathan noticed they were deviating from the planned route, entering a mountainous region he didn't recognize. "Ladies and gentlemen," the pilot's voice now sounded different, almost sarcastic, "I suggest you enjoy the view. It will be a memorable trip." Panic finally overtook him when the cabin lights began to flicker, and the plane lost altitude drastically. He gripped the armrests, his mind replaying every decision that had brought him here, every person he had harmed, every life he had ruined in the name of success. His last thought before impact was of the anonymous message he had ignored. Who had tried to warn him? Why would anyone care about his fate after all he had done? The world spun in slow motion. Metal screamed, glass shattered, and darkness enveloped Jonathan Montgomery like a heavy shroud. His empire, built on ambition and coldness, crumbled with him into the depths of an unknown forest, far from the skyscrapers he once dominated. The last thing his eyes registered was an intense flash, followed by the deepest silence he had ever experienced. The man who had always controlled everything was now completely at the mercy of fate, and fate had very specific plans for Jonathan Montgomery. Consciousness returned gradually, like waves breaking on the shore. First, there were sounds: the soft crackling of a fire, the wind whispering through leaves, a kettle whistling in the distance. Then came the sensations: the warmth of rustic blankets, the smell of medicinal herbs, the rough texture of bandages wrapping his body. Jonathan opened his eyes with difficulty. The environment was simple, almost primitive: wooden walls, a thatched roof, handmade furniture. A cabin, he concluded, trying to organize his still hazy thoughts. The golden light of dusk entered through a small window, dancing on the walls in elongated shadows. He tried to move, and a sharp pain paralyzed him. Every muscle in his body protested, violently reminding him of the events that had brought him here. The crash, the fall, the fear. It all came back in disordered flashes. "Don't move too much," a deep, calm voice sounded from across the room. "Your injuries are still healing." Jonathan slowly turned his head toward the voice. A middle-aged man sat in a rocking chair, weaving what looked like a fishing net. His face, partially covered by a well-groomed grey beard, had familiar features that Jonathan couldn't quite place. Where am I?" His voice came out hoarse, unrecognizable. "Safe," the man replied, not looking up from his work. "That's what matters for now." Jonathan tried to sit up, ignoring the pain. His Italian suit had been replaced by simple cotton clothes. His belongings were nowhere in sight. "I need to make some calls. Contact people." A low, humorless laugh echoed through the cabin. "There's no cell signal here, Mr. Montgomery. No internet, no TV, just the basics to survive." The use of his last name surprised him. "You know who I am?" "I know more about you than you think," the man replied, finally looking up. His eyes were deep, marked by years of experience and perhaps suffering. "The question is, do you know who you are?" The philosophical question irritated Jonathan. "Look, I appreciate the help, but I need to get back to New York immediately. I have urgent matters to attend to." "Ah, yes. The assassination attempt, the board's betrayal, the loss of your empire." The man listed casually, like someone ticking off grocery items. "All that can wait. Here, time works differently." Jonathan felt his blood run cold. How did this stranger know everything? "Who are you?" The man stood up slowly, putting away his handiwork. "For now, I'm just someone who prevented you from meeting the fate they planned for you. As for my identity," he paused, pouring 2 cups of tea from a steaming kettle, "you'll find out at the right time." He approached the bed, offering one of the cups. The aroma was strong and familiar, reminding Jonathan of something he couldn't quite place. "Drink. It will help with the pain." Reluctantly, Jonathan accepted the drink. The hot liquid soothed his throat, bringing unexpected comfort. "Why are you helping me?" "Let's just say I have my reasons," the man replied, returning to his chair. "And perhaps, just perhaps, you need to learn some lessons before returning to your former life." Night began to fall outside, and with it came sounds of the forest that Jonathan had never noticed in his urban life. Owls, crickets, the rustling of trees, a natural symphony that contrasted sharply with the honks and sirens he was used to. "How long was I out?" 3 days, the man replied. "Long enough for the outside world to believe you didn't survive the crash." The realization hit him like a punch. He was officially dead to the world. His enemies had succeeded, at least in part. His empire was in their hands. His life, as he knew it, was over. "I need to prove I'm alive, show the truth." "And what truth would that be, Mr. Montgomery?" the man interrupted, his voice carrying a weight Jonathan didn't understand. "The truth about how you built your empire? About the lives you destroyed along the way? About the fire at the repair shop?" The mention of the fire made Jonathan choke on his tea. A memory tried to surface, the desperate face of Anthony Smith, the rain, the ignored pleas, but he pushed it back into the depths of his mind. "Rest," the man said, standing to light an oil lamp. "Tomorrow, we'll begin your real recovery process, and I'm not just talking about the physical injuries." As darkness swallowed the forest outside, Jonathan remained awake, watching the shadows dance on the thatched ceiling. For the first time in decades, he had no control over anything. Not his destiny, not his location, not even his own identity in the world. And most disturbingly, his mysterious savior seemed to know every skeleton in his closet, every secret he thought was well hidden. Sleep came slowly, lulled by the chirping of crickets and the mystery that now surrounded his existence. His last thoughts were of the city he had left behind and the people who at this very moment were celebrating his supposed demise. Dawn brought with it a routine completely foreign to Jonathan. No imported coffee, no financial newspapers, no morning meetings. Just the singing of birds and the aroma of coffee brewed in a cloth filter, mixed with the smell of homemade bread. His mysterious host maintained a strict routine. He woke before sunrise, prepared breakfast, and went out to check fishing traps by the nearby creek. Jonathan watched him through the window, intrigued by the familiarity of the man's gestures, as if a persistent memory was trying to emerge. "Can you walk?" the man asked upon returning, carrying some fresh fish. Jonathan nodded, rising with difficulty. His muscles still ached, but he was determined to regain some control over his situation. "I need to better understand where I am and who you are." "Follow me," the man replied simply, heading to the back door of the cabin. Outside, a small vegetable garden stretched to the edge of the forest. Medicinal plants, vegetables, and herbs grew in well-tended beds. A rustic wooden bench was positioned under a leafy tree, offering a view of an extensive valley. "Sit," the man indicated. "It's time for some answers." Jonathan obeyed, feeling the morning sun warm his face. The valley below was an endless expanse of green, cut by a winding river that shimmered like silver in the daylight. 3 years ago, the man began, his voice taking on a grave tone, a man lost everything in a mysterious fire. His auto repair shop, built over 30 years of honest work, was reduced to ashes on a rainy night. Jonathan's stomach churned. He knew this story. This man sought help everywhere, banks, friends, even the powerful businessman who had bought the neighboring land. But he found only closed doors and hearts colder than the steel he used to shape. "Anthony Smith," Jonathan murmured, the realization finally hitting him. The man continued, ignoring the interruption. He lost everything: the business, the home, his dignity. His family fell apart under the weight of poverty. But there was one thing he didn't lose: his humanity. Turning to Jonathan, the man removed a small locket from his neck. Inside was an old photo, the repair shop in its prime, with Anthony Smith and his family smiling in front of the establishment. "Did you ever wonder why the insurance didn't cover the fire?" the man asked, his eyes fixed on Jonathan. "Did you ever investigate the strange circumstances of that night?" "That was a long time ago." Jonathan tried to defend himself, but his voice betrayed his insecurity. "Time is relative, Mr. Montgomery. For some, 3 years is an eternity of suffering. For others, it's just a blink of an eye until justice manifests." The man stood up, walking to the edge of the property. From there, he pointed to a structure partially hidden among the trees. "That was the garage where I kept the shop's tools, the only ones I managed to save from the fire." Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. You are Anthony Smith?" "Yes," the man confirmed, turning to face him. "The same man you humiliated on that rainy day. The same one who vowed you would learn about the true value of things." The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan looked at the man with new eyes, now noticing the similarities to the desperate mechanic from 3 years ago. Time had changed Anthony. His hair was grayer, his face more lined, but his eyes retained the same dignity. "Why did you save me?" Jonathan finally managed to ask. "After all I did." "Because unlike you, Mr. Montgomery, I learned that our humanity is priceless," Anthony replied, sitting down again. "And also because I know the truth about the fire, the same truth your partners used to orchestrate your downfall." From his shirt pocket, Anthony pulled out a yellowed envelope. "These are copies of documents proving that the fire was ordered by Richard Mendez. He wanted the land at any cost to impress you, and you, blinded by profit, never questioned his methods." Jonathan's hands trembled as he took the envelope, Here was the proof that his downfall had begun much earlier than he had imagined, planted in fertile soil by his own arrogance. "Now," Anthony continued, "you have a choice to make. You can continue being the man you were, obsessed with power and money, or you can use this experience to rethink your values." The sun was high when they finished that conversation. Jonathan remained seated on the bench, digesting every word, every revelation. The city he had loved so much seemed distant now, like a hazy dream of a former life. Anthony stood up to tend to his chores, leaving Jonathan with his thoughts and the weight of the choices he would have to make. The valley below continued its eternal cycle, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding at its edges. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Jonathan, once the ruthless titan of business, now found himself immersed in a simple, arduous routine on Anthony's property. Physical labor, once considered beneath his manicured hands, became his salvation and punishment. Each morning brought new challenges. Jonathan learned to wake with the rooster's crow, to prepare the soil for planting, to repair fences, and to care for the animals. His hands, once known for signing million-dollar contracts, now calloused from handling simple tools. "The land doesn't care who you were," Anthony said one morning as he taught Jonathan to plant tomato seedlings. "It only cares about what you do now, the care and respect you give it." These lessons, seemingly simple, carried a philosophical weight that Jonathan was only beginning to understand. Every drop of sweat shed in the garden was an atonement for years of greed and disregard for others. At night, exhausted from the day's work, Jonathan found himself reflecting on his past life. The memories of luxury and power now seemed empty, devoid of the human warmth he found in that simple cabin. One afternoon, as they repaired the garage roof, Anthony shared more about his journey after the fire. "I lost everything, but I gained perspective," he said, hammering a shingle. "I discovered that life is more than accumulating possessions. It's about the connections we make, the impact we have on others' lives." Jonathan listened attentively, feeling a mix of admiration and shame. "How did you manage not to become bitter? Not to hate me after everything?" Anthony stopped his work, looking at the horizon. "Hating you would be like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I chose to use my energy to rebuild, not to destroy." These words resonated deeply with Jonathan. He began to realize that his entire life had been built on destruction, of competitors, of family businesses, of entire lives. As time passed, Jonathan integrated into the small local community. He met families who lived simply but with dignity. He participated in community efforts to help neighbors in need, experiencing for the first time the satisfaction of working not for profit, but for solidarity. One day, returning from one of these community actions, Jonathan found Anthony sitting on the porch with a serious expression. "It's time for you to make a decision, Jonathan," Anthony said, indicating the bench beside him. "The outside world still thinks you're dead, but the evidence we have can change that." Jonathan sat down, feeling the weight of that conversation. "What do you suggest?" "You have two options," Anthony explained. "You can use this evidence to reclaim your empire, expose your betrayers, and return to your old life. Or you can choose a different path." "What path would that be?" Jonathan asked, his voice betraying a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Anthony smiled slightly. "A path of redemption. Use your knowledge, your skills, and this evidence not for revenge, but to correct the mistakes of the past. To help those who were harmed by your actions, and by the actions of people like you." The proposal hung in the air like a charged cloud. Jonathan closed his eyes, letting the memories of the past months flood his mind. The hard work, the lessons learned, the lives touched. "And if I choose this path, how do we begin?" he finally asked, his voice laden with emotion. Anthony placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder, a gesture that would have been unthinkable between them before. "We begin by returning to the city, not as the old Jonathan Montgomery, but as a man reborn, ready to use his power for good." That night, as they prepared for the journey back, Jonathan looked up at the starry sky. The constellations, once ignored in his urban life, now told stories of transformation and hope. "I'm ready," he said, more to himself than to Anthony. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and possible disappointments. But for the first time in his life, Jonathan felt he was following a purpose greater than himself. Redemption was not a destination but a journey, and he was just beginning to take the first steps. The city of New York loomed on the horizon like a concrete jungle, so familiar and yet so strange to Jonathan's eyes. The rented car driven by Anthony wound through the busy avenues, each corner bringing back memories of a life that seemed to have happened centuries ago. "Are you ready?" Anthony asked, glancing sideways at Jonathan. "As ready as I can be," he replied, nervously adjusting the simple shirt he wore. No expensive suits or luxury watches this time. The new Jonathan was a different man, both inside and out. Their first destination was a law office in the heart of the city. The lawyer, Mr. Martin, was an old acquaintance of Anthony's, someone they could trust to take the first legal steps. "Mr. Smith, good to see you," the lawyer greeted before turning his curious gaze to Jonathan. "And this must be Jonathan Montgomery," he introduced himself, extending his hand. The lawyer couldn't hide his surprise. "But you were... everyone thought you were..." "It's a long story, Mr. Martin," Anthony interrupted. "And that's why we're here." In the hours that followed, Jonathan and Anthony laid out the entire situation. The staged accident, the evidence against Richard Mendez and the other board members, the plan to use this information not for revenge, but for reparation. Mr. Martin listened attentively, taking notes and occasionally furrowing his brow. "What you're proposing is unusual, to say the least," he commented, adjusting his glasses. "But if you're willing to go down this path, I can help you navigate the legal aspects." The plan was audacious. Jonathan would resurface publicly, not to reclaim his former position, but to expose the corrupt practices within the company and propose a complete restructuring. The idea was to transform Montgomery Enterprises into a model of ethical and sustainable business. "It won't be easy," the lawyer warned. "You'll face resistance from all sides. The current directors will do everything to discredit you." "We're aware of the risks," Jonathan replied, a determination in his voice that even surprised Anthony, "but it's the right thing to do." In the days that followed, Jonathan and Anthony worked tirelessly, preparing documents, contacting trusted allies, and outlining a strategy. Each night, staying in a modest downtown hotel, Jonathan felt the weight of his past decisions and the responsibility of his future actions. A week after their arrival, everything was ready for the big moment. A press conference was called, and the country's major media outlets eagerly awaited the mysterious announcement promised by Mr. Martin's office. On the day of the press conference, Jonathan woke before dawn. Standing before the mirror in the small hotel bathroom, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. It wasn't just the physical changes, the unshaven beard, the calloused hands, but something in his eyes had changed. There was a depth, a compassion that hadn't been there before. "It's time," Anthony said, gently knocking on the door. The hotel's event hall was packed. Journalists, executives, and curious onlookers crowded in, all speculating about the reason for the gathering. When Jonathan finally took the stage, a stunned silence fell over the room, followed by a growing murmur. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite the inner nervousness. "My name is Jonathan Montgomery, and yes, I am alive." What followed was a detailed account of the events of the past months, from the assassination attempt to his personal transformation. Jonathan spared no details about his own past failures and mistakes, taking full responsibility for practices that had harmed many lives. "I'm here today not to reclaim my position or seek revenge," he declared, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm here to propose a change, a complete transformation in the way we do business." He then presented his plan. To use the evidence he had against the current directors, not to destroy them, but to force a complete overhaul of the company. The new Montgomery Enterprises would be an example of social responsibility, business ethics, and sustainability. "This won't be an easy path," Jonathan concluded, "but it's the right one. And I invite each of you to be part of this journey of redemption and transformation." When he finished his speech, the room erupted with questions and camera flashes. Journalists jostled for more details, while executives exchanged worried glances. Amid the chaos, Jonathan caught Anthony's eyes in the crowd. The former mechanic, the man he once scorned and who was now his mentor and friend, nodded with a discreet smile. This was just the first step of a long journey. There would be obstacles, resistance, and challenges ahead. But for the first time in his life, Jonathan felt he was on the right path. The path of redemption. In the weeks following the press conference, New York, and the entire country, was swept up in an unprecedented media storm. Jonathan Montgomery's resurrection, coupled with his explosive revelations, shook the corporate world to its core. Montgomery Enterprises, once a symbol of relentless success, was now at the center of a whirlwind of speculation, investigations, and ethical debates. Richard Mendez and the other board members who had orchestrated Jonathan's downfall were temporarily removed from their positions, as independent audits scrutinized every document, every transaction from the past decade. Jonathan, for his part, faced his own challenges. Divided between interviews, testimonies to authorities, and strategic meetings, he struggled to keep his focus on his main goal, the real and lasting transformation of the company that bore his name. "It's not enough to just expose the mistakes of the past," he explained during a tense meeting with the major shareholders. "We need to build a new business model, one that puts people and ethics at the center of our decisions." Jonathan's proposal was bold: to completely restructure Montgomery Enterprises, turning it into a corporation focused on sustainable development, social innovation, and ethical business practices. This meant sacrificing immediate profits in favor of long-term investments in clean technologies, training programs for underprivileged communities, and partnerships with small entrepreneurs. Naturally, the resistance was fierce. Shareholders worried about their dividends, executives fearing the loss of privileges, and even employees uncertain about the future opposed the proposed changes. "You're throwing away decades of hard work," accused one of the oldest directors during a particularly heated meeting. Jonathan, maintaining the calm he had learned during his months of reflection, replied, "No, I'm proposing that we build on that hard work a legacy we can truly be proud of." Amid this turmoil, Anthony remained an anchor of stability. His constant presence reminded Jonathan of the reason he had chosen this difficult path. One afternoon, as they reviewed strategies in a discreet cafe away from the spotlight, Anthony made an observation that struck a chord with Jonathan. "You know, when you showed up at my door that day asking for help, I could have simply ignored you. It would have been fair, considering our past. But I chose to help not just for you, but for everyone who had been affected by the old Montgomery Enterprises. I see that now you're making that same choice every day." These words reignited Jonathan's determination in the most difficult moments. And there were many. With every step taken toward the company's transformation, new obstacles arose. One of the most tense moments came when they discovered that Richard Mendez had begun destroying crucial evidence. In a coordinated operation with the authorities, Jonathan and his new team managed to recover documents that not only proved the assassination attempt, but also revealed a much broader and deeper corruption scheme than they had imagined. The revelation of this new evidence caused an earthquake in the financial market. Montgomery Enterprises' stock plummeted, and for a moment it seemed that all of Jonathan's efforts would result only in the complete destruction of the company. It was at this critical moment that an unexpected ally emerged. Helen Vasquez, the board member who had participated in the conspiracy against Jonathan, decided to cooperate with the investigations. "I was wrong," she admitted in a private meeting with Jonathan and Anthony. "I thought we were doing what was necessary to save the company, but in reality, we were sinking it even deeper into corruption." With Helen's support and the new evidence, Jonathan finally gained the momentum needed to implement his most radical changes. Montgomery Enterprises announced an unprecedented restructuring plan, a compensation fund for all those negatively affected by the company's past practices, massive investment in research and development of sustainable technologies, training programs, and microcredit for communities where the company operated. A new governance structure that included employee and community representatives on the board of directors. Implementing these plans would not be easy or quick, but for the first time since the beginning of this journey, Jonathan felt they were truly moving forward. As he watched the sunset from the window of his new modest office, Jonathan reflected on the incredible journey of the past months. From fallen titan to agent of change, he had come a long way. "We still have a lot of work ahead," Anthony said, entering the room with 2 cups of coffee. Jonathan nodded, taking one of the cups. "Yes, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm building something worthwhile." The sun set over New York, marking the end of another day of struggle and transformation. The corporate storm had not yet completely passed, but on the horizon, the first signs of a new dawn were beginning to appear. 6 months had passed since the dramatic restructuring of Montgomery Enterprises. The dust was beginning to settle, but the challenges were far from over. Jonathan, now holding the position of Director of Ethical Transformation, a role created specifically to lead the changes, faced the delicate balance between the idealism of his new convictions and the harsh realities of the corporate world. One sunny Saturday morning, as Jonathan participated in a community cleanup in a neighborhood on the outskirts of New York, part of the company's new social responsibility program, he received a call that made his blood run cold. "Mr. Montgomery," said the grave voice on the other end of the line. "This is Dr. Silva from St. Clair's Hospital. We have a patient here, Marina Smith. She listed you as her emergency contact." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Marina Smith, Anthony's ex-wife, the woman who had lost everything in the fire years ago. Jonathan had never met her personally, but her name carried the weight of all the lives he had indirectly impacted in his blind pursuit of power. "What? What's her condition?" Jonathan asked, his voice trembling. "She suffered a stroke. She's stable, but she'll need intensive care." After hanging up, Jonathan stood frozen, his hands shaking. Anthony, who was working beside him in the cleanup, immediately noticed something was wrong. "What happened, Jonathan?" When Jonathan explained the situation, he saw a mix of emotions cross Anthony's face: worry, sadness, and a hint of something that seemed like guilt. "We need to go to the hospital," Anthony said, his voice filled with an urgency Jonathan had never heard before. On the way to the hospital, Anthony finally shared the full story of his family. After the fire and the loss of everything, the stress and financial difficulties had taken a heavy toll on his marriage. Marina, unable to cope with the new reality, had left, taking their daughter, Lisa, who was only 8 at the time. "I never looked for them," Anthony admitted, staring out the car window. "I thought they'd be better off without me, without the memories of what we'd lost." The revelation hit Jonathan like a punch. He had always seen Anthony as a pillar of strength and wisdom, but now he realized that his mentor also carried deep scars and regrets. At the hospital, they found Marina unconscious, machines monitoring her vital signs. Beside her, a young woman of about 18, Lisa, Jonathan presumed, watched them with a mix of confusion and suspicion. "Dad?" she said, her voice a mix of surprise and bitterness as she saw Anthony. The reunion was tense, years of absence and unanswered questions hanging in the air between father and daughter. Jonathan felt like an intruder, witnessing a family drama that indirectly he had helped create. In the days that followed, Jonathan immersed himself in a new mission: to ensure Marina received the best possible treatment and to help reconnect this fractured family. He used his connections to bring in the best specialists, arranged for Marina's transfer to a top rehabilitation clinic, and offered unconditional financial support to Lisa. But money, Jonathan soon realized, couldn't fix everything. The emotional wounds were deep, and Lisa's distrust of her father and of Jonathan himself was palpable. One night, as they kept vigil at Marina's hospital bed, Lisa confronted the 2 men. "Why are you doing this, out of guilt, to clear your consciences?" The question hit Jonathan and Anthony like a thunderbolt. It was the raw truth they both feared facing. Jonathan took a deep breath before answering. "Yes, there's guilt, a lot of guilt. But there's also a genuine desire to do what's right, to try to fix what was broken, even knowing that some things can never be fully repaired." Anthony, tears in his eyes, added, "Lisa, I failed you and your mother. There are no excuses that can erase that, but if you give me a chance, I'd like to try to be the father you both always deserved." The silence that followed was deafening. Lisa looked at the 2 men, then at her unconscious mother, and finally said, I don't know if I can forgive, but maybe we can try to rebuild something new." That moment marked the beginning of a new phase in Jonathan's journey of redemption. He realized that the transformation he sought in the company was just the start. The real challenge lay in repairing the individual lives affected by his past actions. As he watched Anthony and Lisa tentatively talking by Marina's bedside, Jonathan felt the weight of his responsibility more than ever. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was determined to walk it, one step at a time, one life at a time. Night fell over New York, and with it the promise of a new dawn, not just for Jonathan, but for all whose lives he had touched, for better or for worse. The rising sun bathed New York in golden hues as Jonathan arrived at the new community center in the Bronx, right where Anthony's repair shop used to be. The modern building, with its glass and steel facade, contrasted with the older structures in the neighborhood, symbolizing the transformation the area and Jonathan himself had undergone. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery," greeted Maria, the young receptionist, with a warm smile. "The students are already arriving for the first class." Jonathan nodded, feeling a mix of pride and anxiety. This center, funded by Montgomery Enterprises as part of its community reparation program, offered vocational training, legal assistance, and psychological support for residents of the area. It was one of many projects Jonathan had implemented in recent months, each an attempt to right the wrongs of the past. As he walked through the halls, watching the young students head to their classrooms, Jonathan reflected on how much his life had changed. With each step on this journey of redemption, he discovered new layers of complexity in the impact of his past actions. "Jonathan," the familiar voice of Anthony snapped him out of his thoughts. His friend and mentor was coming down the hall, accompanied by Lisa. In the months since Marina's stroke, the relationship between father and daughter had slowly developed, marked by moments of tension, but also precious instances of reconnection. Seeing them together, working side by side at the community center, was a constant reminder to Jonathan of the power of reconciliation. "Good morning," Jonathan greeted, noticing the determined look on Lisa's face. "You two look like you have news." "We do," Anthony replied, a mix of pride and concern in his voice. "Lisa has an idea she wants to share with you." The young woman, who in recent months had become a constant presence at the center, took a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Montgomery, we've been thinking. This center is amazing. It's helping so many people. But what about other communities, other families that were affected by the old Montgomery Enterprises?" Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest. Despite all the efforts, he knew there was still much to be done. "What are you suggesting, Lisa?" "An expansion program," she replied, her eyes shining with determination. "Use this center as a model and replicate it in other areas of the city, in other states even. Not just building centers, but creating a network of support, of opportunities." Lisa's proposal was ambitious, almost utopian, but Jonathan saw in it the same fire, the same passion that had driven him in his own journey of transformation. "It's a huge project," Jonathan commented, his mind already calculating the logistical and financial challenges. "It will require a lot of work, a lot of resources." "I know," Lisa interrupted, her voice firm, "and I'm willing to lead it. With your help, of course." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Anthony, seeing in him a mix of surprise and paternal pride. Lisa's proposal wasn't just about expansion. It was a symbol of her own journey of healing, a way to turn her pain into something positive. "We'll need a team," Jonathan began planning aloud. "Community development experts, lawyers, psychologists." "I've already started making some contacts," Lisa smiled, pulling a folder from her backpack, "including someone I think should lead the legal aspect of the project." When she opened the folder, Jonathan saw a familiar name: Helen Vasquez, the former board member who had allied with him during the crucial moments of the company's restructuring. "Helen?" Jonathan questioned, surprised. "She knows the mistakes of the past better than anyone," Lisa explained, "and she's genuinely committed to fixing them. I think her experience would be invaluable." The wisdom behind Lisa's suggestion impressed Jonathan. She wasn't just proposing a project, she was weaving a web of redemption that included everyone involved in the story of Montgomery Enterprises. "You know, Lisa," Jonathan said, feeling a wave of emotion. "When I started this journey of transformation, I never imagined it would go this far, or that it would inspire others to follow the same path." Anthony placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, his voice filled with pride. "You're planting the seeds of a much bigger change than we imagined, kid." In that moment, watching father and daughter united in a common purpose, Jonathan felt a growing certainty within him. True transformation, he realized, wasn't just in the big corporate actions or the ambitious projects. It was in the small moments of connection, in the individual lives touched, in the families rebuilt. "Let's make it happen," Jonathan declared, extending his hand to Lisa. "Together we'll spread these seeds of change across the country." As he shook Lisa's hand, sealing the commitment to this new chapter of his journey, Jonathan felt a peace he had never experienced in his years as a ruthless tycoon. The road ahead would still be long and challenging, but now he knew he wouldn't walk it alone. Outside, the sun rose over New York, promising a new day full of possibilities. And inside the community center, 3 generations united by a complex past looked to the future with renewed hope, ready to sow the change they wanted to see in the world. The auditorium of Montgomery Enterprises was packed. Shareholders, employees, journalists, and NGO representatives crowded in, eagerly awaiting the start of the annual meeting. In the air, there was a mix of expectation and apprehension. Backstage, Jonathan adjusted his tie, one of the few remnants of his former life he still kept. Beside him, Anthony and Lisa reviewed the presentations one last time. "Ready?" Anthony asked, placing a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "As ready as I can be," he replied, taking a deep breath. "This is the moment of truth." The past months had been an emotional roller coaster. The expansion program proposed by Lisa had come to life, with community centers opening in 5 different states. Each new project brought stories of transformed lives, but also revealed the extent of the damage caused by the old Montgomery Enterprises. Helen Vasquez, now leading the legal team of the project, had been instrumental in navigating the complex legal and ethical challenges that arose at every step. Her dedication to correcting the mistakes of the past was a constant reminder to Jonathan of the power of redemption. But not everything was smooth sailing. The company's radical transformation had significantly affected its short-term profits. Some shareholders were restless, questioning whether the new direction was sustainable. Today, Jonathan would face his toughest test, convincing not just the board, but the entire ecosystem of Montgomery Enterprises that the chosen path was the right one. "It's time," Lisa announced, checking her watch. Jonathan took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The spotlights momentarily blinded him, reminding him of how many times he had been in this position before, always focused on numbers, profits, and power. Today, his speech would be different. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his firm voice echoing through the auditorium. 2 years ago, I was dead to the world. Today, I stand here not just alive, but reborn." The silence was palpable as Jonathan recounted his journey. From the fall to redemption, from the ashes to rebirth. He spared no details about his past mistakes, taking full responsibility for every wrong decision. "Many of you wonder if this new path is viable," he continued, looking directly at the more skeptical shareholders. "If a company can truly thrive by putting people above profits. Today, I'm not here to convince you with words, but with results." With a gesture, Jonathan began a detailed presentation. Graphs and numbers flashed on the screen behind him, showing the impact of the new programs. Reduced employee turnover, increased productivity, improved brand reputation. But beyond the cold numbers, there was something more. "These are Carlos and Maria," Jonathan said, pointing to a couple in the front row. 3 years ago, they lost everything when we closed the factory in their town. Today, they lead our local community center, helping hundreds of families. One by one, Jonathan presented faces and stories, people whose lives had been destroyed by the old Montgomery Enterprises and who were now integral parts of its transformation. Each story was a living testament to the power of change. "Yes, our immediate profits have decreased," Jonathan admitted, his voice filled with emotion. "But what we've gained in human capital, in trust, in purpose, is immeasurable. We're building not just a better company, but a better world." When he finished his speech, The auditorium was silent for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Then slowly someone began to clap. The applause grew, turning into a standing ovation. Jonathan saw tears in the eyes of many in the audience. Employees hugged each other. Shareholders exchanged looks of newfound understanding. Even the most cynical journalists seemed moved. But the most significant moment came when Jonathan stepped off the stage. An elderly woman approached him, taking his hands. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice trembling. "My husband worked for your company for 30 years. When he was laid off, we lost everything. I thought I'd hate you forever. But today I saw the man my husband always believed you could be." Those words hit Jonathan like no applause or praise could. They were living proof that redemption, no matter how difficult and painful, was possible. As the assembly dispersed, Jonathan caught the gazes of Anthony and Lisa in the crowd. Their proud and approving smiles said it all. The final test had been passed, but the journey was far from over. Outside, the sun set over New York, painting the sky in golden and pink hues. It was a reminder that each day brings the promise of a new dawn, of a new chance to make a difference. Jonathan knew that challenges would continue to arise, that the path of redemption was continuous, requiring constant vigilance and dedication. But now, more than ever, he was ready to face whatever came, no longer alone, but supported by a community united by a greater purpose. Night fell over the city. But for Jonathan Montgomery and the new Montgomery Enterprises, it was just the beginning of a new and promising chapter. 5 years had passed since that fateful assembly. The sun rose over a transformed New York, not just in its urban landscape, but in the spirit of its people. In a park in the heart of the city, built on the site of an old Montgomery Enterprises industrial complex, Jonathan walked slowly, watching the families enjoying the Sunday morning. His steps led him to a wooden bench, where Anthony was already waiting. Time had been kind to both, adding more wisdom than wrinkles to their faces. "Good morning, old friend," Anthony greeted, a warm smile on his face. "Good morning," Jonathan replied, sitting beside him. "Hard to believe it's been 5 years, isn't it?" Anthony nodded, his gaze sweeping the park. "Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that you showed up at my door needing help. Other times, it feels like a lifetime ago." The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with shared memories and overcome challenges. Montgomery Enterprises, now simply known as ME Communities, had become a global model of corporate social responsibility. The community centers initiated by Lisa now spread across the country and began inspiring similar projects in other nations. "How's Marina?" Jonathan asked, breaking the silence. Anthony's face lit up. "Better every day. The doctors say her recovery is almost a miracle. She's even talked about returning to teaching music to kids at the community center." The mention of Marina was a constant reminder to Jonathan of the lasting impact of his past actions and the importance of his current work. Every life touched, every family rebuilt, was a step toward true redemption. "And Lisa, I heard she has big news," Jonathan commented. Anthony laughed, a mix of pride and disbelief in his voice. "My daughter, the future city councilwoman. Who would have thought? She wants to take the community center model to municipal politics." Lisa's transformation from a bitter young woman to a passionate community leader was, for Jonathan, one of the greatest proofs of the power of change. She had not only forgiven, but embraced the mission of turning pain into purpose. "And you, Jonathan?" Anthony asked, turning to face him. "How do you feel after all these years?" Jonathan took a deep breath, letting the question echo in his mind. "You know, Anthony, when I started this journey, I thought it was about personal redemption, about clearing my name, easing my conscience. But I discovered it's much bigger than that." He paused, watching a child playing happily on a nearby swing. "It's about creating a legacy, not a legacy of wealth or power, but of positive impact. Every smile in this park, every family helped in our centers, every life transformed, that's the true legacy." Anthony nodded, understanding deeply. "A legacy of hope." "Exactly," Jonathan agreed. "And the most amazing thing is that it's not just our legacy. It's the legacy of every person who chose to believe in change, who decided to give a second chance to themselves and to others. At that moment, as if the universe wanted to underline their words, they saw Helen Vasquez walking through the park, accompanied by a group of young lawyers. She spotted them and waved, her face lit up by a smile. She was a living reminder that redemption was within reach for all who genuinely sought it. "You know what amazes me most, Jonathan," Anthony said, watching Helen walk away. "How a single decision can trigger such a huge wave of transformation. Your choice to change didn't just affect you, but touched countless lives." Jonathan reflected on those words. Every decision, every action was like a stone thrown into a pond, creating ripples that spread far beyond the initial point of impact. "What's next?" Anthony asked. "What's the next chapter?" Jonathan smiled, a glint of determination in his eyes. "We continue. We keep learning, growing, helping. The work of building a better world never really ends, does it? But now we know that every small step counts." They stood up, ready to face whatever the future held. As they walked through the park, Jonathan noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small plaque discreetly placed near the entrance. Approaching it, he read the engraved words, "Second Chance Park, a place where everyone can start anew." Those simple words perfectly summed up the journey not just of Jonathan, but of all who had been touched by it. It was a silent testament that no matter how dark the night, there's always the possibility of a new dawn. Jonathan and Anthony continued their walk, leaving the park behind, but carrying with them the promise of a better future. The sun was now high in the sky, bathing the city in a golden light of infinite possibilities. The story of Jonathan Montgomery, the tycoon who fell and rose again, transforming himself and the world around him, would continue to inspire generations. Not as a fairy tale of instant redemption, but as a powerful reminder that true change is a continuous journey, made of small acts of courage, compassion, and perseverance. And so, under the blue sky of a reborn New York, life went on. Not an ending, but a new beginning, full of promises and possibilities for all those willing to embrace the opportunity of a second chance.